So I was speaking of like online events. I was talking with preparing the content for a panel that I'm having with a bunch of Dell Tech people and some Frost and Sullivan people about basically like, I don't know, innovation in the automotive space and also manufacturing and telco to a limited extent, but more of the idea of like, I mean, I don't know if you've heard this, but data is the new oil. Uh, or something, right? But we got all this data going on, and I mean, I'm being kind of dismissive because I don't think people have like brought to market something doing with the data explosion we were told about 10 years ago, except for like targeting Instagram ads at me. We got that down. That oil is always washing up on my shores. But
I think you're wrong. I think there's a just from my time at large financial institutions and others, I think people
yeah,
there,
yeah.
you just don't see it. They're using the data, but you don't see it. Yeah.
That's fair. That's fair. I think no, I think you're exactly right. And it's I guess in a way in the consumer life that it seems to like change my life beyond like ad targeting. It's never too apparent to me. I don't know. Maybe I have to think about it more. Anyways, in the space of like cars and stuff, we were discussing kind of speaking to a bunch of like automotive industry people about like data and software and cars and whatever. That's all fine over there. I should put a link to the webinar, or it's not a webinar. It's like an online event people want to attend. But one of the topics that came up was like the industrial use of open source. And what I mean by industrial use is like, so when auto manufacturers and their, I forget what they call it in auto manufacturing, but whoever their partners are, the OEMs, no, OEMs are the actual manufacturers like VW and Ford, right? And then there's like the supply chain that they buy stuff from. And there's some jargon word they use for their suppliers or whatever. But more of the question was like, so a lot of the software that people are building that are in cars or used around in the car ecosystem is like based on open source at the core. Like the example someone used is like, they'll get Elastic as a search thing, and then they'll wrap their proprietary project around it. And like that's kind of sort of a newish thing, right? In software for the auto industry. And so the general topic was just sort of like, when you're early out figuring out we're going to talk on a panel, the topic was, so how about that? Right? Like people have questions about like having open source in there and managing it versus, getting distros or doing it themselves. And I always feel it's a little bit like, it's almost hard for me as always having worked at a vendor to kind of like answer a question like that, because my answer is just like, what's the question, right? Like ever since I've been a programmer, like you just make sure the license is cool and you use open source and you're done, right? There's no like,
Well, so you used that
no strategy behind it.
There's an interesting word there. You said use open source.
Yes,
And
that's
I
right.
think the big question is, what does that mean?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
what the meaning of that is has changed quite a bit, right? You can use open source by using something like Ubuntu server. You're using open source. It's supported. You can use something like like you talked. You can use it for monitoring. You can find some of the observability projects out there and use them. Then there's building your own open source, creating your own project, right? That's build. You can do that. That has its own set of problems. Then there is, and this is kind of what you described, there is using open source to build new things.
Yeah.
And the question is, where is that appropriate? So in the auto industry, if you're talking about that, where maybe the software that they put into cars is a differentiator, maybe there's a justification for that. So that's it's a core part of their business. However, if they're building their own load balancer from open source components, that doesn't help them compete. So and it doesn't actually add value to their business, but there's a cost to it. And I'm seeing a lot of that. I'm seeing we're building our own things. They think they're using open source, but what they're doing is creating something new that they've integrated with their own proprietary stuff that they then have to support forever.
Yeah.
And that can be a problem. It's actually the same problem I used to see a decade and a half ago, but the implementation is different. So what I used to see is they would use a single project like Apache HTTP, Apache web server, and then they would modify it. In fact, I know of a financial institution that heavily modified Apache 1.3. Then they think those modifications, those are proprietary. Those somehow help them compete. They're wrong, but that's what they think. So they keep those separate. And when the new versions of Apache 1.3 come out, they patch it and they work hard to do it themselves. They've integrated everything into their customer-facing websites using it. That in that specific case, what happened was Apache 2 came out.
Right.
The people that originally wrote this, the extensions for them, they're gone. They had based everything, all their processes around these modifications to Apache 1.3 that they thought were proprietary. They thought they were intellectual property. Then so they just kept using Apache 1.3 for another year. Then security updates stopped.
Right.
The API for modifying and for talking to Apache changed from Apache 1.3 to 1.2. So the changes they made, they couldn't move, especially without the original authors. And as a financial institution, they couldn't have something unsupported. So it ended up paying someone tens of millions of dollars to dig them out of a hole that they never needed to be in. So I think while instead of thinking that these things are intellectual property, these little things, we're making the same sort of mistake. We're accepting this cost and this debt for something that doesn't have business value. And I think there's going to be that's the people that a good example of this is what I see people doing with Kubernetes. They're taking the open source stuff, integrating it with other stuff, integrating it with their internal enterprise stuff that they wrote 15 years ago. The people that are doing that for them in 5 years are going to be gone. They're going to have all of their infrastructure based on something that they can't update. They're not getting security patches, and there's a cost to it. Now, are there reasons to do it? Yes. Like if your business, if your business can compete better, if it adds value to your business, then maybe there's a reason to do it. But if it's basic infrastructure, there isn't. So
so there's a few things to pull apart there. One, I think there's three. I wrote down four, but let me think of the three. One is like, so when the topic of and this is why one of the reasons you and I want to talk about this is it comes up all the time. I remember I had a meeting long ago with some oil and gas people, and they were looking to build like a common shared platform that they would use for their like oil and gas ERP stuff. And there was like lengthy conversations about everything related to open source. And the first conversation is one that like, I think if you're not used to, and I don't mean this to sound insulting, but if you're not used to like software development in your organization, and like you don't it's not something that you're familiar with, you first have a lot of questions just about using open source, right? Like you don't know if it's like reliable or whatever, like, but you haven't, and I remember way back, and I'm sure at some point, before you became a lot involved in open source, but you kind of went through this as well, where you're like, what is this thing? I've got to figure out the way it works, and is it reliable and trustworthy? And after a while, you're like, oh yeah, this is totally like a legit means of producing mission critical software, right? Like it's no problem. So that's, never really a question. But then two, there's this other thing that you hear a lot with open source, which I think is it's kind of the meat of what would be interesting, that is interesting to talk about, is that you have to identify, is this something that I want to be a unique competitive advantage, right? And we'll just stick with cars because that's an interesting mixture of like industrial and consumer, right? Kind of, sort of. I guess it's literally industrial, but you know what I mean. like, you know, you have the so-called infotainment system in a car, right? And that would be a good example to discuss of like, is that strategic or something that should be outsourced? And then before we go back to that, like the third thing, which again is kind of like part of that, is let's call it what are the costs of maintaining modifications that you have to something, and also what are the costs of just using it, right? Like the second one is not that, like, for example, Apache 2 comes out, I got to upgrade it, right? Which is different than, well, I mean, you always have to upgrade it, but using open source sort of implies that like you're on your own, right? If you're not paying for support for it, so you do have to account for this cost of like, how do I do the maintenance of the open source thing and support it? And that's a cost I have to consider as well. But I think those middle two things I mentioned, one, like, how do you figure out if something is commodity is the wrong word, but something that you should just like not care about, right? Like that you should just outsource.
How do you figure out what's important to your business?
Exactly. Yeah. And then two, I think a filter, like why I'm always a little bit unsatisfied with that way of thinking about using open source is I think there is another consideration, which is like, well, how hard / easy is it to kind of like maintain the modifications that we have? And I can't think of any examples of like things are really easy to like a web server is a hard thing to maintain modifications to, but there, I mean, there are some there must be some technologies that are kind of sort of easy to customize. Like
actually, a web server is easy because there's an API for doing that, right? And except for when they changed that API,
sure.
which was a major version release, it actually was easy because they make it extensible and modular. Yeah. So that's actually a pretty good example of if that thing was good for your business, you know, maybe the cost isn't too high. Now, if you are maintaining patches on GCC because you think it makes your executables faster, not that would be anything people do these days. That would be the cost of that would be insane, right? That it would never be worth it. You know, it would never be worth it. And there are many things probably like that where the cost isn't worth it. But what I see, which is the opposite of what I advise people, is they don't figure out what's important before they start working with open source, before they start either contributing back to open source or using open source to build new things. They don't figure out what has business value, and you know, write down an algorithm like, if it does this and this and this, then this is important enough for us to own or for us to put money towards, so that and keep something separate. They don't figure that out ahead of time. So
how do you like begin when you think to that? How do you begin that analysis? And like, you know, like I've never really understood. I've never taken the time to appreciate and understand like Wardley map stuff, but that's like somewhere in there. So you got that going on, right? But I feel like, as with all like great models, like it needs like it's like way complicated, and it's complicated because you're talking about these like little marginal differences, not differences, but like, so you could pretty much make a blanket statement. And again, as you're always good at doing, you can point out the exceptions, but like you should probably just use an off the shelf, off the web, like web server, just like.
Oh yes.
You don't even need to make a map for that, right?
No, and I wish I was smart enough to make Wardley maps.
Yeah, and then, you know, obviously we're biased, right? But like, you should also not, you know, build Kubernetes from source, right? Like, you know, there's almost this category, just to be very loosely, of like infrastructure, right? Like you don't really need to customize infrastructure
unless you're an infrastructure provider. And then that might be your core business, right?
Right.
Then you might be able to differentiate that way. Yes.
Exactly. And then you sort of creep above that, and you're like, so the example I was using, so like a search engine, right? Like, I don't know about you, like so a search engine, probably not, right? Like you know, that you embed in your software. But then I'm thinking back to the car thing. Like every time I try to use a GPS thing in a car, it's just a disaster, and I just use it on my phone, right? Like it tries to be so helpful with auto completing stuff and put the address, the street in before the address number. And I'm just like, and like, I just want to like, use the one on my phone, which is much better. So it's kind of like, is that map software? Should that be customized and be different? Like, like it's all, or like if also, if you're in a car, like is like the maintenance software a differentiation point or not? Or like, it's almost like the problem with a lot of like strategic analysis that I see is it doesn't necessarily bring into account preference for how you want to compete. Right, in the sense of like, you could say like, we don't really want to compete on maintenance workers having an easy job, so we just outsource,
at the beginning you asked how you decide and how you start. And then you talked about maintenance, and like that, for me, where you start is the vision of the company, the very top. Like, what are you trying to do? And some companies have a very strong vision, and from that you can move down the line and find ways that you can implement that vision. It helps you define what you do. So if let's say that you're a car company and you're part of your mission and your vision is that we're going to provide the smartest cars that maintain themselves. That's going to be our, like, I don't know if that's a valid vision, but then if that's going to be your thing, that's the way you're approaching the market, then maintenance software might be something that's proprietary.
Yeah.
That
Like
might be important.
I could imagine, like, instead of a check engine light, it would be nice if it would say like, you need to change your oil, and then it would like have some picture showing me where the oil was, and maybe even a little light bulb on the exact thing to open up. Like, I mean, that's kind of an absurd example, but like, yeah. So there are things like that, and I think at this point in the vision to strategy to implementation cycle, the other thing that always confounds me, and as people tell me often, I think too much, so I should probably just stop thinking when I get confounded. But it's sort of like, there's also the thing of like existing competencies that we have, and then ones that we want to take a bet on attaining. Right? Like in the sense of like, we don't do any of that now, but it would be cool if we did. So, and this might be an area where people fall down the trap of like, customizing GCC, where they're like, maybe there actually is something awesome that we could develop that was a competitive advantage if we do this. And so it's almost like, it's this hard, when you're going through strategy, I'm always weary of like, I'm weary of myself often. I'm always leery of sort of like, we're only basing our vision on what we can currently do, not on new things we can come up with and new things that we want to enter into, which is especially difficult if you're kind of basing like choices you make on what our vision is. I don't know, but it's so there's the first thing. You got to know what you want to do. And I think my issue with that is always like, well, I don't know what I want to do, so maybe I shouldn't be using open source.
Well, if you don't know what you want to do, there's a bigger problem at the company.
That's right.
To be honest, I find it to be a common problem.
Yeah.
Where like they don't have a vision, they don't have an idea for how they're going to really differentiate. So yeah, but yeah, they need that. They need to know what they're going to do. I think if you don't have that, it's a non-starter, right? No matter what you do, it's wrong. And back to the since I like to give my opinions on things, back to the car with all the automate with all of their consumer facing mapping. And I think that's a mistake to invest in that stuff, because like you said, I want to use my phone. My phone knows where I go. My phone knows what music I listen to. My phone knows everything. So anything that they're trying to do that doesn't just display my phone data on their little screen is a waste of money for me. And maybe it's fine for my parents, right? Maybe it's fine for the generation before me, baby boomers. Maybe they need that. They don't feel as comfortable with their phones. But certainly people younger than me and myself, I everything that I need in my life is in my phone. I don't need a car interface. Like I had that, a fairly advanced one, and I never used, like it had, the car could, I could give it voice commands. They almost never worked. I had to say things in such a specific way. They're not going to compete trying to understand voice and doing AI with Google and Apple and others. And so trying to be
Yeah.
that is a path to failure. That's my
Yeah,
opinion.
and I think that's the thing I'm like bumbling through is that is a good example. Like, so let me see if I can make something coherent out of this. So on the one hand, like I know just enough about strategy and have just like a little bit of practice doing it that like I can imagine the meetings where the car people sit down, and I'm just going to say infotainment because that sounds great. And they sit down and they talk about the infotainment and the maps, and they're like, this is going to be a core reason people do things. And of course, they're going to have a screenshot of Tesla up there because I've only seen Tesla's got some fancy software in it, right? Like, and people are always very impressed by a gigantic screen. And so they're going to, and people want to develop, as you said at some point, builders like to build things. And so like, there's going to be a significant amount of people who want to build this out and like make the driver facing software interface. And so it's going to seem like if we can do that, people are going to want to buy this car for the software and whatever, right? Like it's going to be a big differentiator that only we have because we've done it in-house. And so like that has some appeal to it. So I've got that on my like, builder strategy thing. But then the other thing is like there also needs to be, we're like way beyond software and open source stuff, but there needs to be this analysis that's basically like, yeah, but we're not going to do a good job at that. Right? Like,
yeah.
Like, and that kind of like,
so I asked
capability assessment.
So I break it down really simple. So there's the first is, can we? And that's like, can we? And the second is, should we? Right? And like, even if you, like, maybe you can do this. Maybe the auto companies can build their own infotainment, but the Google and Apple already have the customers. They already own the data. So maybe they could, but they shouldn't. In a lot of cases, especially with Kubernetes, what I find is that they can't and they shouldn't. So the answer to both those questions is no.
And maybe this little let's call it strategy quandary that I think about every now and then is because the strategy work I've done firsthand is often not, what am I trying to say? It was often not based on innovation. You know what I mean? Like I did a lot of M&A, which is more based on innovation in corporate structure and portfolio and go to market and say, like, all synergies, as they say, right? Whereas like there's another type of strategy that is more based on like, well, we're just going to have the best way of doing something. And what we're assessing is that we have the capabilities to do something so good that let's say 15 to 30% of the market will want to buy us because we have that capability.
That's the Apple way, or at least it was with Steve Jobs. I'm not convinced it is now, but yeah.
Yeah, and it is the way of a lot of, I mean, I think maybe being able to do that is yet another thing that non-tech companies get all enamored of when they say they want to be like tech companies, is being able to kind of be that winner take all new way of doing things, right? Like, which is interesting, but it's difficult to do in other areas. So it's hard for me to envision, like, even at like if you're doing car manufacturing, like it's hard for me to think of like, how are you going to do anything better than making it really easy for me to plug my phone into the car. Right? And like that's got to be like a hard thing for a car company or anyone else to kind of like, swallow, to kind of take on. I mean, maybe just, well, we're just kind of like going off the rails of open source here, but to use another example, which is fun to like explore, and this might be a way out of that trap. So, I don't know about how your kids are or were or whatever, but like my kids don't do the best job at brushing their teeth.
Oh my
So
God.
every time now when my view of the dentist is top three people who tell me I'm a terrible person annually, right? Because you take your kids in there, and especially here in the Netherlands, the dentist looks over you and they're just like, "What are you doing, man?" Right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, they don't hold back.
yeah, and
Yes.
and 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 you're like, as with all people give you parenting advice, you want to have a really sarcastic reply where you're like, "Oh, that's fascinating. I have never thought about doing that and tried to like pull my hair out. Interesting." But so we got them these fancy like Oral-B toothbrush things that you can hook up to your phone, and it like not only tells you like how long to brush your teeth and where to position it, but it's also encouraging for kids because it uses this AR stuff to like whatever. And like that idea is so good, but the implementation of it I think is okay. But I'm going to judge it by, if you were to ask me, do my kids use it? The answer is no. So like regardless of whatever, it's a failure. Right? And so like, however, I feel like if like that's the kind of thing, again, to think about bringing software into a mechanical thing, it's a car and a toothbrush, like that seems like a lot more potential that Oral-B could actually do a lot of differentiation, that their software for doing that toothbrush like is really good, and the way that it integrates with the phone versus like I feel like with the car, like what are you
And
gonna do?
the car manufacturers are learning that. I think you couldn't buy one of these fancy new cars with infotainment that didn't have Android Auto and whatever the Apple one is. I don't know,
Like
Apple
Apple
Car.
Car, yeah.
Yeah. You couldn't buy a car without that. They know that's a requirement, and like they used to. They used to charge more for different levels of the infotainment system, but no one will pay it, right? So I think they're seeing now that they have to see that the writing's on the wall. But there's, in most businesses, there is a desire to own the customer, own the relationship with the customer, and know as much about that customer as possible. And I think there's probably some reticence to give that up.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
that's probably like two main slides and 10 slides in the backup deck pitching why you should do your own infotainment thing is as I said earlier, data is the new oil.
yeah.
And so that
But that still doesn't make it a good, if that's not what the consumer wants, and if you're not someone that has the kind of vision that Steve Jobs did, you're not going to move. The industry's moving another way. It's not that you're
yeah.
seeing the future, it's that you're trying to pull it from the way it's going, and that takes some serious strength in the market to change a market when the consumers want something different.
Yeah. Maybe so. To move towards wrapping up here, let's just bring it a little bit back towards open source. I think there's a work in progress quip we could have here about open source if you're considering using it, which is be extremely careful. Assume that no is the answer to the following. Will we be able to achieve like strategic differentiation or competitive advantage by customizing this open source? Chances are the answer is no. So like be really, really careful if you think that by getting the source code, modifying it, and recompiling, never minding even APIs, but just basically by like forking, a word I don't hear that much anymore, but by forking this open source thing, if you think you're going to base like differentiation on that, you should spend some time thinking about that. Unless
but we should
unless
talk
you're a
next
software
time
company or a tech company.
if it's in your wheelhouse. Yeah, but we should talk
Yeah.
next time about where the value you can actually get out of open source, how to interact with the projects, how to like there are things you can do that can add value to your business.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's just I think quite often people are doing the wrong things because they're doing the same thing they did years ago. They don't understand what should be intellectual property and what shouldn't be. They can't figure out what their main thing is. They think everything's their main thing. Everything's important.
Yeah. And that like then it'd be I was about to say it'd be fun to like work in a strategy group again, which is not fun. It's fun to have done that, but it's never fun to actually work in it because that's a grind of a job. But like I think I haven't thought about this in a long time. We used to talk about this way back in 2015 and 2016 when I'm sure you have both given and received these slides where slide one in your EVC presentation, software vendor or vendor talking to a prospective buyer. Slide one is like, hi, I'm this person. This is our company sometimes. But then slide two in like 2015, 2016 was the one we used was 6 logos of like Tesla, Airbnb, Uber, and Google. And it was basically like these 6 logos are coming to destroy your business, right? And like I remember one of the stories we would tell to insurance companies, and by story I don't mean it was false. It was just something people freaked out about. Was like
narrative.
Narrative. There you go. Yes. One summer, Google decided they would experiment selling car insurance in Nebraska or something, right? And you see this nowadays with Amazon getting into pharmacy stuff, and like it's just like, and that sounds terrible that you're going to have these other companies coming in and just like taking over your business. But I think and that was a big enough, scary enough bugbear back then that like it was generally worth it to kind of like consider it and kind of stop in your tracks and think about it. But nowadays, like as you were going over that, what I'm realizing is there's a much more strategically nuanced way of putting it or thinking about it, is that like, I forget what you call it in strategy, is it complementary products? But like nowadays, you have to be really careful that your suppliers and your complementary products kind of like flip the relationship of the business that you have, and they become the primary, we say owning the customer, but they become the primary product, and you now become a supplier, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that like if I don't know, I would hope that strategy groups spend a lot of time paying attention to that kind of thing, of like never minding what business we're in or what we're going to compete on. Let's really pay attention to this weird competitive landscape where suddenly, to use one of my favorite phrases from Horace Dediu, as you were just kind of saying, like a car is just a nice accessory for my phone, right? Like I was thinking about this yesterday, like, it'd be nice to have a car around here, even though it's nice not to have one. But, when we can travel again, it's fun to just have a car. And like, I don't really care what car I get as long as it has Apple Car in it, right? Like, I just like, I don't know, I probably want a station wagon because I got 3 kids and a dog and my wife and I, and we got suitcases. But whatever it is, doesn't matter. Like, I just want to be able to plug my phone in. And like that's not a situation you want to, that's a situation where everything's flipped, mm-hmm. right? Because of, and that must be super frustrating.
it is. They're seeing the market change in a way they don't want. That's frustrating, right?
Yeah, but it is good motivation. Like when I was reading that like Amazon was going to move into at least in the U.S. into prescription stuff. It was funny. I'll have to go back and look at the article. It was funny reading through it because like everyone's freaking out, and then there's even quotes from the Amazon people where they don't quite say it this like cartoonishly, but at some point there's a quote where it's like, wow, there are a lot of regulatory problems in entering this business. But you have to imagine from a just an e-commerce company's position. They're like, I don't get it. A product comes in, people fill out a thing, you send your product out. And it seems
it's all
like
logistics.
It seems like a very solvable problem, but it is I don't know. Hopefully it's a good encouragement for optimization in that system. But we should continue our open source.
Yeah, there's a lot of good open source things to talk about.
But that's the first one. There is like, you can always use open source. That's no problem in general, right? Like, but when it comes to like, do we outsource this part of our strategy to open source, or do we keep this part of our strategy proprietary? Right?
Yeah, and everyone uses open source. There's no one on this planet right now that's not using open source in some way. There's nothing you're doing. Like, no company is open source free. This in 1998, that was not the case. Yeah, but now it is absolutely the case.
Right. So that's the next thing to get over, which is how I got distracted by all the strategy stuff. Is the next type of question is like, So you can embed open source. That's no problem. But the question becomes then, do you fork open source and customize it to your own need? And that's where you have to have a much more lengthy conversation about, of course, the question is the hassle worth it, right? Which just begs the question, yes, is the hassle worth it? Right? And that's where things get more complicated. And so far we've got a rule of thumb in most cases, or I always like this way of doing a rule of thumb. If you've asked the question, the answer is no. Right? Like,
yes. That's true. I mean, that's true.
Yeah. But that's the other avenue to go down. And I think things like cars and toothbrushes. We'll have to think of like 2 or 3 other things where you could have kind of an example driven discussion of like, I mean, another one is like that you would know about is sort of payments, right? Like, they got Tiki over. I got to go here, but like, they have Tiki over here.
Yeah.
But then there's also Apple Pay and other things, and like Tiki was kind of it was like a way that you can pay with QR codes. There's probably some name for this, but whatever. The banks kind of got together here in the Netherlands, and you could pay with QR codes, and it was great, and it is great.
It's a very, very Dutch app, though.
Yeah. And it was sort of kind of like, I don't know if there's a lot of differentiation in Dutch banking because they all supported it, but like it was a good idea that made things easier. But now it's once again, it's sort of like, I don't know, you can also just pay with your phone now, and that's cool. So we don't need to do that anymore. But I mean, it'd be fun to go through like, I don't know, 4 or 5 industry examples where it's just like, when do we choose to do this software on our own versus when do we just outsource it to someone else and just let them do it?
And I have an answer that I give. Whether it's right or not, we can figure out next time.
That's right. Well, that will be the exciting next episode that we'll get to. Now, as always, this has been Tanzu Talk. I've got a fancy new domain name, Rick. Can you guess what it is?
Is it Tanzu Talk?
That's right, TanzuTalk.com. The .com was available. I didn't have to get a .show or a .plumber or a .foundation. So you can go to TanzuTalk.com, and that will show you the show notes and the archives and everything like that. And if you're one of the streaming people, I'm not going to do an episode tomorrow because my kids have the day off, which means I'm taking the day off. And then I don't know what I'm going to do next week. In the U.S., it's Thanksgiving, so I'll see what days I take off and don't take off. Give me some consulting, Rick. What do I do for Thanksgiving? What's your recommendation?
You do the same thing you do every day, which is nothing. At least here in the U.S.
That's right. Oh, you mean on Thanksgiving? What do I thought you were saying like in general, I should apply what I do every day to Thanksgiving.
No.
I got it. Yeah. I got to figure out which days I take off and not, but I won't be streaming.
So you need to do what every American expat says they need to do when they're shopping for a flat overseas. You need to bake a 20-pound turkey in a small European oven.
My wife, speaking of outsourcing, my wife made a strategic decision, and we are outsourcing our Thanksgiving meal.
That's smart.
One of the 4 places that I got to go pick it up near Vondel Park somewhere, but
I was going to say I have a turkey supplier in Amsterdam for you. One of the meat markets in Albert Kuip has turkeys.
I'm going to write that down. I have a turkey supplier in Amsterdam for you. Yeah, so we'll be outsourcing it, and it actually, like, the menu looks, it's fun. Like when you get a traditional thing that you always cook on your own, not only from somewhere else but from in a whole other country, because there's some slight variations on it. Like I think we're getting a Waldorf salad, which is something I would never think to have with Thanksgiving, which would be delightful.
What? You guys don't have Waldorf salad? With your Thanksgiving?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I don't. Isn't a Waldorf salad like chicken and nuts and grapes? And
it's mayonnaise, grapes, walnuts, and lettuce. I only know because of the Faulty Towers episode where they say that over and over again. They say the ingredient list in a Faulty Tower episode over and over again.
That makes sense.
I'm not sure I've had a Waldorf salad.
Yeah, man, I haven't. They're always good. Now I'm thinking of pimento cheese, so I better wrap up.
Ooh,
Here.
hey, that's we can get that here. That's a
I
southern
know.
thing.
No, you're lucky. Every time I went through the Charlotte airport, there's some pseudo hipstery place and that has like 6 types of pimento cheese, and I would go there and buy at least 1 tub and just sit down and eat it. Boy,
But a cheese toasty, Dutch style, made with pimento cheese would be delicious.
This is what I tell people all the time: is you get a burger, and you have equal thickness of rare cooked meat and pimento cheese. You'll never forget that burger. Hopefully in a good way. But that's the best.
Next week on Tanzu Talk, pimento cheese and pecan pies.
Next time you get on, we'll plan a little bit ahead of time, and you should get some pimento cheese, and you can do some taste testing.
I can do that.
All right. Well, as always, like I said, you can go to tanzutalk.com to see the show notes and everything, and we'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye.